Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron, the only daily live broadcast in the New York metropolitan and greater Long Island area, on which pastors, Christian scholars, and theologians have a platform to address the burning issues facing the church and the world today. Proverbs 27:17 tells us, iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Matthew Henry said that in this passage, we are cautioned to take heed whom we converse with and directed to have in view in conversation to make one another wiser and better. It is our hope that this goal will be accomplished over the next hour, and we hope to hear from you, the listener, with your own questions. And now, here's our host, Chris Arnzen.
Good afternoon, Long Island, New York, Connecticut, and those listening internationally over the Internet. This is Chris Arnzen, your host of Iron Sharpens Iron. Everyone is familiar with the fact that the term Nazi is synonymous with white supremacist racism, anti-Semitism, sadistic brutality, and the genocidal ideology that gave birth to the mass slaughter of European civilians and especially millions of Jews during World War II, known as the Holocaust. But many are shocked or remain in disbelief when hearing that the Nazi Party is deeply rooted and inseparably rooted in an early 20th century version of the homosexual activist movement. Did you know that the Nazi Party was largely created and developed by homosexuals and pederasts who regularly gathered in gay bars in the early 20th century Germany with a pro-homosexual political agenda? Well, to discuss this today is author Scott Lively, an evangelical Christian pastor and founder of Abiding Truth Ministries and Defend the Family International. We're going to be addressing the theme of his very controversial book, co-authored with Orthodox Jewish historian Kevin Abrams, called The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. We'll also learn about why on earth this is relevant to the Christian church in the 21st century. If you'd like to join us on the air with a question for Scott Lively, our number is 631-321-WNYG. 631-321-WNYG. Even if you want to remain anonymous, if it makes you feel more comfortable, you may do so at 631-321-WNYG. Want to pick up the phone during the station break? Call your family, friends, and loved ones. Tell them to tune in to 1440 AM on the dial if they live on Long Island, the Bronx, the Yonkers, the Jersey Shore, the coast of Connecticut, but they can hear the program anywhere on the planet Earth via live streaming at WNYGSpiritofNY.com. That's WNYGSpiritofNY.com. And they can also hear the program at sharpens.org, SHARPENS.org. We'll be right back after these messages with Scott Lively. Welcome back. This is Chris Arnzen, your host of Iron Sharpens Iron. And if you've just tuned us in, we are going to be discussing a very, very controversial book titled The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. And the author of that book, who actually co-wrote it with an Orthodox Jewish historian, Kevin Abrams, is today on our program Scott Lively, an evangelical Christian pastor and a founding of Abiding Truth Ministries and Defend the Family International. And it's great to have you back on the program, Scott Lively.
It's very good to be here.
And first of all, explain the title and the premise of the book. Why the title, The Pink Swastika, and what's the premise of the book?
Well, the Pink Swastika is about the homosexual roots of the Nazi Party. Mm-hmm. Most people think that the gay rights movement started here in the United States. It's not true. It started in Germany in the 1860s. It came to full power by the 1920s, and without the German gay movement, there never would have been a Nazi Party. That's how completely entrenched the Nazi Party was in homosexuality, especially in its early years.
Mm-hmm. And the actual title, though, The Pink Swastika, wasn't that sort of a takeoff on a book that was a pro-homosexual book that came out earlier called The Pink Triangle?
Yeah. Well, actually, the Pink Triangle was adopted by the American gay movement to try to equate homosexuality with Judaism as a category that the Nazis supposedly attempted to exterminate in the concentration camps, because the Nazis used a set of varyingly colored inverted triangles to identify different classes of prisoners that were put in concentration camps. And yeah, it's true that there were homosexuals in concentration camps, the work camps, not the death camps, and they were tagged with a inverted pink triangle. But the real story is much bigger than that, and that's what we go into in the book. Yeah,
we'll get later on in the broadcast. We'll actually address the alleged persecution of homosexuals by Nazis. But I want to get to right now the genesis of this movement. Explain to our listeners who Ernst Röhm was. I know that he may be more responsible for the Nazi Party's growth than Hitler himself, but explain to our listeners who he was.
Yes, this is, of course, Ernst Röhm appeared in the early years preceding the party itself. It was actually, Ernst Röhm was a captain in the German military. Hitler was just a corporal, and Ernst Röhm was the one who had all the connections with the military-industrial leaders and with the nationalist organizations that were really pushing to rid Germany of the Weimar government. And he and Adolf Hitler were the ones who actually infiltrated or joined the German Workers' Party in about 1918, and then they changed the, actually it was 1921, I think. They changed the name, they took it over, changed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Röhm was the dominant figure at that time. He was really the power that was running things at that in those early couple of years. But then Adolf Hitler sort of grew past him and became the symbol of the party.
Yes, and Ernst Röhm was so notorious and unashamed and open as a homosexual pederast that...
Oh, yeah, it was in the German newspapers. It was, you know, there are many accounts of Ernst Röhm's homosexuality. He was actually recruited into homosexuality by Gerhard Rossbach, who was the creator and founder of what we know today as the brown shirts, the Sturmabteilung. And Rossbach faded out. He was, you know, Röhm sort of pushed him aside after a while, took the power of the SA, the brown shirts, and went on. But he was actually the most notorious homosexual in the Nazi Party, and but he wasn't the only one by any means.
Right. Well, the reason I bring up the notorious nature of his homosexuality is that even homosexual sympathizers and liberals today cannot deny that. In fact, PBS, well known for its left-wing leaning on most things, aired a mini-series, or a documentary, I should say, that ran for several weeks, if I'm not mistaken, several years ago, probably actually a decade or so ago, on Ernst Röhm, and they were very clear and open about the fact that there was no mistake. He was an unashamed, unabashed homosexual pederast.
Well, one of the reasons why the gays are so willing to acknowledge his homosexuality is that he was the primary target of the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, and which they then claim was the beginning of a so-called gay Holocaust, which is a lie. But they can say, oh, yeah, well, sure, there were homosexuals before that, but afterwards, yeah, that's when the Nazi Party really showed its true colors, and then they began the gay Holocaust.
Well, the Night of the Long Knives is when Ernst Röhm was...
They've taken a few pieces of information, a few facts, and sort of built this gigantic house of cards out of it, and we refute all of that in the book.
Now, the Night of the Long Knives is when Ernst Röhm and some of his SA men were assassinated by Hitler's henchmen, correct?
Right, and the Hitler's henchmen that actually carried out the assassinations were all homosexuals, too. And they continued to serve him long after that, so that alone refutes the idea that it was the beginning of a gay Holocaust. But the real story behind the Night of the Long Knives is that was, you know, that was June 28th, I believe, that weekend, 1934. It was only 2 years, a year and a half after Hitler had become the Chancellor of Germany, And he and Ernst Röhm had finally come to power. And they'd always had a deal that when they finally achieved power, Hitler would run the government, Röhm would run the military, and that's what they were going forward to do. But the military industrialists connected with the Italian fascists at the time. They hated Ernst Röhm. Mm-hmm. Now, the SA, the brown shirts, had become an organization of almost 3 million men.
Wow.
And the German army was only, the official German army, which in their traditional gray uniforms, was only 100,000 because of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And so the official military leadership, had this pitifully small group compared to Ernst Röhm, and they were terrified that he was actually going to be able to take over, and they would be subject to him. So they went to Hitler, and this was still in the early days of Hitler's government, and they told him, look, you either get rid of him, or we're going to take down your government. And so Hitler, being the pragmatist that he was, decided to go ahead and kill Röhm and the elite of the SA. But he added to that, he said, okay, well, if I'm going to have to do this, then I'm going to wipe out all of my political enemies, and you're not going to say anything about it. And so he killed, estimates are from 400 to a couple thousand people, including everyone that had known, almost everyone, that had known Hitler as a teenager when he was a homosexual prostitute on the streets of Vienna and Munich.
So going back to Ernst Röhm, when he was actually a force to be reckoned with in Germany, was not he and his thugs, if you will, in the SA, the brown shirts, weren't they the ones mainly responsible for Kristallnacht and many of the early atrocities against Jews in Germany?
Yeah, well, the Nazi Party really was a military organization when it came right down to it. The nationalists, after World War I, when the socialists had taken over the government, they began looking for a way to take power back into their own hands. And when the Treaty of Versailles had put all of these soldiers out of work, the nationalists just simply organized them into all these different sort of non-military organizations. They looked non-military, but and so the Nazi Party wasn't the only organization of its type. There were lots of them out there, and they were almost all military organizations with the goal of putting the nationals back in political power. Mm-hmm. And Hitler just happened to be the one that scored the goal.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to repeat for our listeners who may have just tuned in, I'm interviewing today Scott Lively, the author of The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. And the thing that may amaze many folk, because of the fact that has been drummed into most of our heads that among their other areas of bigotry, the Nazis hated homosexuals as much as they hated the Jews and non-whites and so forth. But in your book, you seek to document that most in the hierarchy of Nazi Germany were either themselves homosexuals or close companions of homosexuals. Is that...
Well, when we're not talking about the government itself. We're talking about Hitler's inner circle.
Yes.
Hitler himself was a homosexual. He surrounded himself with male homosexuals his entire adult life, from the time he was a teenager until he died in the bunker. And almost everybody that was a very close associate of his was homosexual. There were some that weren't. But, his private lawyer, his private financial advisor, all of his bodyguards, the deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi Party, the head of the Hitler Youth, Walter von Schirach, the list goes on and on and on. And but outside of that, there were a lot of them in the brown shirts, especially in the early days. It was almost exclusively homosexual in the early 20s. And then, of course, when it grew to be 3 million, just the raw numbers, the homosexuals don't represent that much of the population. Mm-hmm. So even though many of them were very high up, they really represented a small proportion of the brown shirts by the mid 30s, mm-hmm. early 30s. So
yes, and these brown shirts, when it was almost exclusively, if not entirely homosexual in its earlier years in the 20s, Weren't they the ones, though, that really started fanning the flames of Jewish persecution by breaking the store windows of Jewish...
Oh, yeah, that was what it was all about. Hitler was a viciously anti-Semitic, but the reason that he was anti-Semitic is also tied to homosexuality. Remember, I said Hitler was a male prostitute when he was a teenager, and at that time, he was tied in with the German gay subculture, which was actually quite significant at that point. It was probably as big in Germany then as it is today in the United States. It wasn't as open. I'd say maybe more like the 60s or the 70s compared to today in Germany. But there was a major hero, a war hero from the Prussian Wars, pre-World War I, who had attained a very, very, very high political post with the Kaiser. And there was a whole ring of homosexuals because of this guy that was controlling the German Kaiser at that time. That was exposed to the newspapers, and there was a huge scandal and a trial in 1907 exposing the homosexual control of the Kaiser. And the people that did the expose, the ones that did it, were Jewish newspaper publishers who were the ones who were breaking the gay power and causing these men to become shamed and disgraced in the public. That's exactly the time in Hitler's Mein Kampf. Now, he never mentions this at all, but it's exactly the time frame when he talks about having shifted from respect for the Jews for hatred of them. And that's the reason, is because he hated the Jews more for their moral code than he did for their race. But he couldn't be open about that because he could never admit that he himself was a homosexual. So he focused on the racial aspect, and there was a lot of racial, it wasn't entirely a moral issue, but the hatred of the Jews was at least as much hatred of Jewish morality as it was Jewish ethnicity.
Now, why is it that your average person today has come to the conclusion that the Nazis hated homosexuals just as much as they hated Jews?
Well, that's because that's the propaganda. I mean, from the 1960s, no publisher in the United States has published any book that admits homosexuals were involved in the Nazi Party, except the ones that pre-existed. William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and some of these others that they simply can't suppress. You can still find the details in there. But from the end of the 1960s to the present, nobody will publish any of this stuff. So it's been completely eliminated from the public mind. And then at the same time, you have during that same time period, you have the gay movement promoting the idea that they were victims like the Jews and using the pink triangle as their symbol. You don't see it as much now in the past 10 years. Ever since the pink swastika came out, they stopped doing that. They switched over to the rainbow as their primary symbol because they didn't want to sort of, beg the question and then have this information become public knowledge.
In fact, this is a good time for us to go to a break. If you'd like to join us on the air with a question for Scott Lively, whether you agree with what he's saying, whether you disagree with what he's saying, or whether you've never heard what he's saying before and you're just not certain, our number is 631-321-WNYG, 631-321-WNYG. We'll be right back after these messages with Scott Lively, co-author of The Pink Swastika. Welcome back. This is Chris Arns, and we are interviewing today Scott Lively, Evangelical Christian pastor, founder of Abiding Truth Ministries and Defend the Family International, and co-author, along with Jewish historian Kevin Abrams, of the book The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. Scott, isn't it true, though, that Hitler had made speeches, public speeches, in which he strongly denounced homosexuality, and wasn't there not efforts made to even strengthen the anti-homosexual laws in Germany?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that there was. Hitler was terrified that the German public would find out about his own homosexuality. And so he maintained a very aggressive anti-homosexual public policy. Public policy
is the key word.
The rhetoric was very, very strong.
Right.
In practice, it only, you remember, we're talking about the Germany during the height of its occupation of other countries, and over the course of 12 years, only 50,000 homosexuals were ever arrested, right, under the German anti-sodomy laws in all the territories. And only 5,000 to 15,000 of those ever went to a concentration camp. And at that time, at the height, there were over 10,000 concentration camps. We're not talking about the death camps. The homosexuals were not sent there unless they happened to be Jewish. That was for the extermination of the Jews. The work camps, it was just slave labor. And anybody that got arrested for anything was sent to the camps. If you were a pickpocket or a prostitute or a thief, if you got arrested, you were sent to the camp. So, I mean, it sounds terrible, and it was no fun to be in a Nazi concentration camp, but it's a very different story from what they're trying to portray.
Yes.
And it was only effeminate homosexuals who were ever sent to the camps. Some of them were killed. You know, the ones that were the most hated political enemies. And the key to understanding is to realize that there were two factions of the German gay movement. The effeminate branch of the movement was the founding branch. A man named Karl Heinrich Ulrich, the man who launched the modern homosexual movement. He's called the grandfather of gay rights. He invented the third sex theory of homosexuality that said that male homosexuals were really female souls trapped inside men's bodies. As a counter to that very feminine perspective of homosexuals, a masculine-oriented faction formed around the turn of the last century, 1902, called the Gemeinschafter Eigenen, the community of the special ones. These guys considered themselves more masculine than natural men. This type of pederast, these are really into man-boy sex, man-teenage-boy sex. They've always been around. They modeled themselves on the Spartan culture of the ancient Greeks and other warrior societies, and that's the group out of which the Nazi Party came. And the two factions, the butch macho faction and the effeminate faction, hated each other. They fought against each other. It was the femme faction that actually exposed Ernst Röhm to the German newspapers. That's why he was, whenever the Nazi Party looked like it might actually gain power in Parliament, gain seats, then the femmes who were associated with the communists, they would go to the newspapers and just expose all of this homosexuality, and then the Nazis would lose their public support. So when Hitler finally came to power, he actually, it was 1932, but he didn't become chancellor until, I think, early 33. Then, one of the first things that he did, May 6, 1933, was he sent the Goon Squad over to shut down the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which was the headquarters of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which is the organization that had been founded by Karl Heinrich Ulrich. It was the headquarters of the effeminate branch of the German gay movement. And the people that he sent over were the masculine homosexuals of the SA, posing as a different entity.
So as we had brought up, the accounts that we're hearing of persecution of homosexuals by Nazis during World War II Germany, they are grossly exaggerated, and they were never anywhere close to the par of the persecution on par with the persecution of Jews.
And there were as many as 15,000 homosexuals who died in concentration camps, and that's not to be excused. That's not to be diminished. Those people did not deserve to be killed that way. But compared to all of the other groups that suffered, I mean, homosexuals were among the fewest, and the people who were persecuting them were also homosexuals.
Right.
So to suggest that somehow that all gays deserve to have a survivor status or public sympathy as a victim group is absurd. The perpetrators were themselves homosexual.
And in fact, it's one of the things that is ironic is that several years ago there was an HBO special that was produced by a homosexual, and his documentary was an investigation of the persecution of homosexuals during during Nazi Germany in World War II, and he actually in many cases, came to the same conclusions you did. But that's the irony of it, is that he said that most of those homosexuals who died in the camps died of disease. They were not typically people who were tortured and murdered. They were very often, if not most often, given the opportunity to rehabilitate and leave the camps if they vowed not to return to their former lifestyle. And this was coming from a pro-homosexual documentary, which surprised me. But I had heard that there were Jews who were victims of the Holocaust who actually protested or picketed one of the Holocaust museums because of its inclusion of the homosexual wing, because they knew that Jews and others had been victims of homosexual prisoners in the camps, and that the Nazis were using the homosexuals to torture and molest other prisoners. Is that true?
That's true. I mean, the guard structure of the camps, the concentration camps, was heavily homosexual, and that's the book, The Pink Swastika. You can read it online at my website, defendthefamily.com, and we'd like people to buy the book, but the actual text of the entire book is published online, and you can check out all the sources for yourself. But that issue is addressed as well as everything else that we've talked about today, and importantly, this book is 400 pages of documentation. Every single page is one citation after another, and at least a quarter of the citations are from homosexual scholars and historians themselves. And most of the rest of them come from reputable mainstream historians, either that lived during that time or that have written subsequently, mostly in foreign countries, because in the U.S. you couldn't get away with publishing any of this.
Now, what kind of opposition have you gotten over this? Obviously, there must be somebody out there who has a pro-homosexual agenda who is trying to refute your book and your documentation and somehow cast aspersion on what you intend.
There's been some internet stuff where they've tried to say, to blast the book, but the facts speak for themselves. And frankly, when I published the book in 1995, the first edition, the majority of the attacks that I used to face prior to that stopped. They do not want this information to be public. They will never. I've never gotten any of them to ever agree to debate this publicly. This is probably the most damaging information to the gay movement that's out there. Because everything that they have as a movement is built upon victim status.
And also
ultimate acts to the root of that lie.
Well, one of the reasons I found this information fascinating several years ago when I first discovered it is that you constantly hear homosexuals and liberal activists hurl the accusation at evangelical Christians that we are the Nazis. Yeah,
you're the Nazis. You're acting like a Nazi.
Yes.
It's so outrageous. When I first, it was 1993 or so, when I first, actually even before that, 92, when I first discovered some of this information. I was the spokesman for a ballot measure campaign in the state of Oregon that was opposed to the gay agenda. I really didn't know much about the issue before that campaign, and I really got my eyes open. But the gays ran their entire Oregon campaign on the theme that people who oppose gay rights are like the Nazis. And in the middle of the campaign, this Mormon guy came down to my office with a sheaf of about 20 or 30 pages of just quotes from different books, and he said, they've got it all wrong. That the finger should be pointing the other way. Here, look at this. I thought the guy was a kook. Right? I didn't even read it all. I just read a couple of I believed all of the propaganda. And I thought my job as a Christian was to differentiate the moral opposition to homosexuality from the Nazi hate-based opposition. And then about a year after that, when we were in another election cycle, doing local elections, city and county elections, ballot measures, the local leader of the gay movement in Salem, Oregon, during that campaign, wrote a letter to the paper saying he just returned from Germany where he'd visited Dachau and what an amazing similarity there was between the Oregon Citizens Alliance, my organization, and the Nazis. And I said, okay, I've had enough. I went to the file, I pulled this thing out, and for the first time I read it. My jaw dropped to the desk. And I read these quotes, and I said, how in the world? Because these are people like William Shirer and Conrad Hayden and Otto Scott, people that knew Hitler personally, and that were the top historians of the period. And I said, how could the public not know about this? And how can the media, who has to know some of these facts, have never ever allowed any of these details to be revealed in the public? And so I wrote a guest opinion to the paper in response to that letter, citing about 10 different quotes. And it set off this huge firestorm, 6 weeks of controversy in the paper every single day, letters back and forth. And I realized this was dynamite. And so in the middle of that, Kevin Abrams called down from Canada because he'd heard about this. And over the phone, we agreed to write a book on this theme together. And we just started digging in, pulling out every source that we could find on this issue. It's been, it's over 10 years now of research. The 4th edition has dramatically expanded. It's more than double the size of the original edition. And I've got more now. I've probably got another 20 pages worth of stuff for a 5th edition.
Mm-hmm. So, in other words, the opposition of those making any attempt to refute what you've written is really not even noteworthy.
It's, when there's a website out there, the annotated Pink Swastika. Anybody that wants to try to debunk the book, go ahead and try. When I did the 3rd edition, I went and read that entire website. I think it's done by some college professor from Wisconsin. That's what I heard. Rumor. I don't even try to take it off of the net. Just let it sit there. It's a rebuttal to the 1st edition. Mm-hmm. And so when I did the 3rd edition, I went through, I read the whole thing, and whenever I saw something that I thought might have some merit, I went ahead, did a little more research, and if I thought it was relevant and that they had a point, I went ahead and modified it. So the 3rd edition of the book actually was dramatically strengthened as a result of the rebuttal of the 1st edition. Mm. And then when we did the 4th edition, we added another 50 or 75 pages of documentation, a lot of which came from Professor Lothar Machten's book called The Hidden Hitler. He's a German history professor from Bremen, I think, Germany. Mm-hmm. And he absolutely proves the case that Hitler was homosexual. We didn't actually, until the 4th edition, we didn't conclusively state that Hitler was, because even though there's a large amount of circumstantial evidence, there wasn't enough to really say, yes, 100%. We were like 85, 90% sure that I was personally sure, but I wasn't ready to say so. But anyway, that's where we are. The Pink Swastika will stand up against any challenge, and right now I'll repeat, I will debate anybody, anywhere on this theme. I welcome it, and you can put up any Harvard-trained historian, anybody. I will deal with the facts on this, and it will. And I'll win the debate, hands down.
And Hitler was just an all-around deviant any way you look at him. Isn't it believed that he even had some kind of incestuous relationship with his niece who committed suicide after that?
Oh, yeah. Hitler was sort of pansexual. He was, if you could really nail him down, he actually sort of breaks the mold, because he was a self-loathing, effeminate male homosexual. Mm-hmm. Now, whereas most of the rest of his cronies were genuine masculine-oriented homosexuals, mm-hmm. he was one of a type that actually was hated himself because of his feminine tendencies. Mm-hmm. If you read about the way he lived, his room looked like a girl's room, and things like that. He was very effeminate in his personal habits, and that he hated that aspect of himself, and the way that he overcompensated by brutality. Mm-hmm. That his rhetoric was beyond anybody else's rhetoric, and his actions were more brutal than anyone's. Mm-hmm. And the person, another one that fits that type in the modern era is Mohammed Atta, the guy who flew the plane into the tower. Mm-hmm. He was a self-loathing, from what I can read. There's sketchy information, but it really does appear he was of the exact same type, a self-loathing, effeminate homosexual who overcompensated by extreme brutality.
We have to go to a break right now. If you'd like to join us on the air with a question for Scott Lively, whether you agree, whether you disagree, whether you've never heard of any of this before, and if you'd like to remain anonymous, you may do so if it makes you feel more comfortable. 631-321-WNYG, 631-321-WNYG. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is Chris Arns, and our guest today is Scott Lively, author of the PINK Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. We do have a caller on the line. We have Dr. Lehrman in Roslyn, Long Island, New York. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron, Dr. Lehrman. I guess...
Hello?
Yes, hello, Dr. Lehrman.
I'm here.
Yeah, welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. Can you hear me, Dr. Lehrman? Well,
Dr. Lehrman, don't listen to your computer.
Yes, listen to the phone, Dr. Lehrman. You're probably listening to delay or something. Just turn on... Anyway, but while Dr. Lehrman's trying to figure out how to listen to us on the radio, I think he may have... Yes, he may have hung up on us. I just wanted to read a quick couple of endorsements for this book. Hello, Dr. Lehrman? Is this Scott? You're still there, Scott, right? Well, anyway, while both of my guests are trying to get back connected with us, I wanted to read a couple of endorsements for the book. One is from Dr. Judith Reisman, Institute for Media. She said of this book, as a Jewish scholar who lost hundreds of her family in the Holocaust, I welcome the Pink Swastika as courageous and timely. Lively and Abrams reveal the reigning gay history as revisionist and expose the super male German homosexuals for what they were. Nazi brutes, not Nazi victims. I think we have our caller back on the line. Dr. Lehrman? Dr. Lehrman, if you are listening, please do not listen.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Lehrman, can you hear me? I have a feeling that we're not going to be able to take this call because Dr. Lehrman doesn't seem to, he's not...
Hello?
Hello, Dr. Lehrman. Scott, you're here. You're here,
I can
right?
hear Dr. Lehrman, but I can barely hear you.
Okay, I can hear Dr. Lehrman, too. He cannot hear us for some reason. I don't know why. Let's go through the roster of...
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Lehrman.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine, Dr. Lehrman.
I cannot hear you.
Okay, well, I guess we're not going to be able to take your call then. I'm not sure why.
I cannot hear you.
Okay. Can you hear us now, Dr. Lehrman?
Now I can hear you.
Okay. Dr. Lehrman, you have a question. Dr. Lehrman, do you have a question?
I have a comment.
Okay, great.
Can't hear you.
Well, that's all right. Just give her your comment. We don't need to hear... you don't need to hear us. What's your
comment is... I have two comments. First of all, I think Scott's work is absolutely magnificent and has been for years. I have some small issues I'd like to raise, not in disagreement, but in supplementation of what Scott has said. Number one, the notion of one of the major reasons for Nazi anti-Semitism was the Jewish insistence on sexual purity. Judaism demands, or has always demanded, that the only sexual activity which is sacred is that within marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of marriage, it is not sacred. Mm-hmm. And Judaism has been very strict on that until recent times when the gays have taken over many of the Jewish organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Second point I want to make is that the notion of homosexuality's irreversibility is one of the major myths that has been perpetrated, and I think that Scott has dealt with that at different times also.
Well,
those are my points.
Thank you for your points, Dr. Lehrman, and perhaps you could listen to the rest of the program off of the computer, okay? Yes, we'll have to let Dr. Lehrman listen to the rest of the program off of his computer or phone because obviously we're having troubles communicating with him. He must be having phone problems. But you want to comment on Dr. Lehrman's comments, Scott?
Yes, well, I of course agree with what he said, and Dr. Lehrman has been a supporter of the book, and he helped me to make contact with a number of rabbis in the United States regarding the problem of the promotion of the gay Holocaust myth in the American Holocaust Museum system. And so I'm grateful for his help. He's also written some very, very good articles in his own right, some of which are actually published on my site, defendthefamily.com.
Oh, really? So if anybody wants to get in touch with him, they could go to your website.
Well, I don't know if there's a contact. There's contact information there, but there are some of his articles are published there in the archives, or the resource archives. We have, as a matter of fact, just to make a plug for the site, we have probably the most extensive collection of free resources on the internet dealing with the homosexual issue from a Christian perspective. And, defendthefamily.com, almost all of my books and other writings are there, published for free. And then we've got probably 4,000 news articles going back 6 or 7 years, and then a whole resource section. And then anything we don't have, we have links to the people that do.
Let me go through the roster of the most notorious Nazis that most people who have any knowledge of World War II history and so forth would probably recognize these names. Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Rudolf Hess, Hermann Goering, Martin Bormann, Reinhard Heydrich, and Dr. Joseph Mengele. Out of those, how many of those were active homosexual?
Most of that list. I don't know about Mengele. Himmler is a probable. But since he was the head of the security system, there's almost nothing that you can find out about Himmler. He controlled the security apparatus, and of course nothing got out about him. But I don't think that he would have been in Hitler's inner circle as deeply as he was if he wasn't homosexual, because virtually everyone else was. To add to the list, as I said before, Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Hitler Youth, Walter Funk, the Reich Minister of Economics, who was Hitler's private financial advisor as well. Hans Frank, who was the Gauleiter of one of the Gaus, the districts. He's a leader of one of the districts. He was Hitler's personal attorney. Maurice, Hitler's chauffeur. The Hess is another very well known. He was the deputy Führer of the party. Of course, he flew to England in 1941, supposedly to broker a peace treaty. I actually interviewed Colonel Eugene Bird, who was the commandant of Spandau Prison in Berlin, where Rudolf Hess was, and the other Nuremberg defendants were jailed after the Nuremberg trials. And Colonel Bird is a very interesting figure in his own right. He said that Hess actually accepted the Lord before he died.
Wow. The other men who are very well known, Goebbels and Goering, Bormann, any knowledge of what their...
Goering was more of the transvestite type. Bormann, there's some evidence of him. Remember, it's kind of sketchy on some of them. Some of the ones that we have the most information about are ones that were second tier, the inner circle to Hitler. But some of these other guys we're talking about ended up in the party apparatus, not just because they were Adolf Hitler's friends, but because they were some power faction that allowed them to actually be there in that system. So, if you have any experience with politics, anybody out there, you know how this sort of thing works. Not every person in George Bush's administration walks in lockstep with him, but there's a bunch of them that have to be there just because they're of the powers that are behind the political scene. So that's the case with some of these. Bormann probably was. Himmler probably was. Hess certainly was. Goering was a transvestite. And Mengele I have no information about.
Well, all of these men, though, were fully aware of the deep roots of homosexuality in the party, though, correct?
Yes. There was no secrets. There was a man named Hans Bleuer that wrote some material in the early days before the Nazis actually came to power, and really exposed a lot of what was going on inside the party. And I've got a quote that I used to read in all of my speeches it's a quote from the homosexual vice chair of the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, and it. I was trying to find it here. I don't remember what page it was on, but it's basically saying that the reason that the Nazis destroyed the Sex Research Institute May 6, 1933, was that they had over 40,000 records that specifically linked Nazi leaders and party members to sexual perversion, especially homosexuality. And that those records were actually the bulk of the pile that was burned May 10th, 1933, in that famous file footage that, whenever they do a historical clip of about book burning or about the early Nazi Party, you see that bonfire with people throwing copies of Thomas Mann and other literary classics in there. The bulk of that pile was actually the records of the Sex Research Institute of Berlin. The Nazis were burning the records of their own perversions. And this is from the homosexual assistant director of that institute. That's his. That's a quote from him. So.
Well, we have to go to a break right now, Scott. I'd like you to focus, when we come back, on why is this relevant to a Christian in the United States in the 21st century today. And if you'd like to join us on the air with a question, this is your last opportunity at 631-321-WNYG, 631-321-WNYG. Don't go away. Welcome back. Scott, a lot of people might say this is fascinating stuff, especially for a World War II history buff. But why is this really relevant for the average Christian in the United States in the 21st century? Why is this information relevant at all?
Well, what the gays did to Germany, they're doing to the United States. You have to understand, this is the ultimate spiritual battle. And in fact, the entire culture war really boils down to a conflict between people who are biblical Christians and homosexual political activists. We have contradictory philosophies and ideologies that are completely contradictory and mutually exclusive. The society that we want and that we had to a large extent was based on the Judeo-Christian ethic, sexual ethic of monogamous heterosexual marriage for life. The gay philosophy and the danger of the movement is that its goal is the elimination of the Judeo-Christian sexual ethic and the replacement of that with a different moral system that embraces what they call sexual freedom. These two philosophies are completely contradictory, and they cannot coexist. You cannot have a marriage-oriented society that also embraces sexual promiscuity. The two things are not compatible. And so for every success that the gay movement has, the church loses. That's just that simple. And that's the way it's always been, and that's why we're in such incredible trouble and danger as a society today. I don't hate homosexuals. I want them to be saved. I want them to have the same blessing that I have enjoying the heterosexual design that God built into all of us. But the movement itself, I hate with a passion, with a godly passion, because its entire purpose is to destroy the influence of Christianity in the world. And both Christianity and the gay movement are global in scope, that they have a central unifying philosophy on each side. We have the Great Commission to make disciples of every nation, teaching them to obey all that God has commanded, to going out into all the world to do that. They have that unifying philosophy of creating a society that embraces and is based upon sexual license, sexual freedom, anarchy, if you will. And both sides have all the resources that they need to accomplish their goal. And really the only difference between the Christian church and the gay movement is that the gays know that they're at war, and we don't. Most of the people in the churches are completely asleep. And that's why today, across America, you do not see outspoken, born-again, Bible-believing Christians sitting in the seats of power. the universities, the television stations, the newspapers, the mega corporations. They're not there, but you see many, many outspoken homosexuals in those places, and that's very dangerous. The cultural inertia that we took for granted for a long time, what our great grandparents gave us, the Christian nation, that caused us to have such incredible security and prosperity. The inertia of that culture has almost disappeared, and we are reaping now a whirlwind of chaos in the family structure, the breakdown of the family, the divorce, the mental health problems, drug and alcohol addictions, the expansion of government power. All of these things are directly associated with the shift from respecting God's design for the family, that sex belongs inside of marriage, and shifting to a society that embraces sexual promiscuity.
Very quickly, Scott, a lot of our listeners might not be aware that Long Island was actually a very important hub of the American Nazi movement prior to World War II. Camp Siegfried out in Yaphank had as many as 40,000 pro-Nazis traveling out there every year for their festivities and so forth out on Long Island. What do we know about this situation with the homosexual involvement of the American Nazi movement up until today?
Well, the first homosexual organization in the United States was an American chapter of the German Society for Human Rights. They used the same theme back then. In fact, the most prominent German member of the Society for Human Rights was Ernst Röhm. And following World War I, a lot of American soldiers were stationed in Germany, and one of them, a man named Henry Gerber, came to the United States and in 1924 formed a chapter of that German organization. And it didn't last very long. The Gerber and his two associates, primary associates, were arrested for having sex with boys, and the organization was shut down. But very interestingly, Gerber had sex with a boy, a teenage boy, who, when he grew up, he seduced another boy named Harry Hay. Harry Hay launched in the late 1940s, early 1950s, an organization called the Mattachine Society, which was the first homosexual organization to continue on after its formation. And Harry Hay is today known as the father of gay rights, an outspoken champion of pedophilia and other sexual perversions. And that link to Germany, to Chicago, to Harry Hay and the Mattachine Society, just like an evil game of tag.
Yeah. Well, very quickly, Scott, let our listeners know how they can contact you.
Through my website, that's really the only way to do it. defendthefamily.com. There's an email option there. I review all the email messages that come through. And like I said, all of my books and other resources there online. You can make a donation to my ministry. You can buy the books. You can educate yourself on the issue.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. The time flew by too fast. We look forward to having you back at some point in the future. I want to thank all of you who listened today. I want to thank Dr. Lehrman, who tried to communicate with us on the phone today. And I want all of you listening to remember for the rest of your lives that Jesus Christ is a far, far greater Savior than you are a sinner. God bless.